Welcome to ARVN, Amateur Radio Video News. The program you're about to see is free to watch, courtesy of YouTube. Thanks, YouTube. But it wasn't free to make. ARVN's got a lot of money invested in video equipment like this sweet camera and that editing system back there. And it takes a lot of time to shoot and edit a program like this. So I'm asking you to make a voluntary payment, contribution, whatever you want to call it. Just stop by our website, arvn.tv, and you'll see a link to make that payment, whatever you think the program is worth to you. I guess you could say that this program is brought to you by you. So thanks for watching and enjoy the show.
With our regulatory theme of the morning, we have next up our pleasure to have Brennan Price, Chief Technology Officer at the ARRL and 4XQX, and WRC-12 Agenda Item 1.19, Regulatory Considerations for Software-Defined and Cognitive Radio Systems. Take it away, Brennan.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brennan. I'm a lawyer. I've been sober for about 3 years. It's good to be here. It's always a pleasure to be at the TAPR DCC. As I mentioned in my opening remarks this morning, it's good to catch up with people who are interested in and continue to continue to push the bounds of what amateur radio can do. And it is my philosophy and certainly the philosophy of the League to encourage those activities and promote them in any way we can. So we like to think that sponsoring this conference is a way we can do that, and we like to do so. I want to give you an update on preparations for the upcoming World Radio Communication Conference this morning. My predecessor, Paul Rinaldo, who's here in the audience today, first briefed you on this in 2008. I updated you in 2009 about issues before WRC-12 regarding software-defined and cognitive radio. This particular agenda item has reached some degree of certainty, at least as much certainty as one can have in this business, which is inherently very little. This is going to be very highly regulatory talk, not that much of a technical talk. I gotta be me, like I said, I'm a lawyer. But there is some technical content in here, and we'll see if you can spot it at the next time. So when I last spoke with you, WRC-12 was WRC-11. It was supposed to be ongoing right now. That didn't go over for a variety of reasons. A number of countries objected because a part of it conflicted with Ramadan. They had attempted to move it to another time this year. However, it conflicted with Yom Kippur and was in a venue that had some issues. So the General Secretariat decided to solve two problems at once. Not only does the moving of the conference from January 23rd to February 27th, 2012 avoid any conflicts with any major religious holidays, it also puts the conference in a new budget cycle. So that permits the ITU to balance their books. It will be held in Geneva. And the conference preparatory meeting, which is a big meeting to produce the conference preparatory meeting report, which is a book about yay big, listing the technical background of each of the 35 agenda items and providing methods that various administrations as ITU speak for countries essentially, have come up with to satisfy the items. So the conference preparatory meeting essentially sets the groundwork for the starting point of WRC-12. The report of that meeting is a rather influential document which gets people's minds thinking and toward certain resolutions. As I said, there are 35 separate agenda items. They continue potential changes to the ITU radio regulations. The radio regulations are a treaty-level instrument containing the International Table of Allocations and rules governing the various radio services. In a number of countries which don't have regulatory schemes that are as well developed as the United States and some other industrialized countries, the ITU radio regulations essentially serve as the regulations. So it's an important document, not just in those countries, but we think for the global health of the amateur radio service, because if we're, as experimenters and hobbyists and disaster relief providers, we travel with our equipment, and sometimes these are the rules we have to play by. The ARRL CTO's office, with its staff of 2.5 people, myself, my professional colleague, John Seiverling, and our part-time administrative assistant, Virginia McFarland, we are tasked with a number of tasks. Among other things is international advocacy, and this primarily involves advocacy before the ITU and preparation for international meetings, such as WRC-12. So we've spoken before about Agenda Item 1.19. Agenda Item 1.19 is quoted in its entirety on this slide here. It considers, as with most WRC agenda items, it's rather broad. To consider regulatory measures and their relevance in order to enable the introduction of software-defined radio and cognitive systems based on the results of ITUR studies conducted in accordance with some resolution, which I put in the proceedings of the conference 2 years ago, which we're not really going to talk about today. But so this is the issue. Now, anytime you have an item before the WRC, good things can happen and bad things can happen. You might recall me, for those of you who were in Elk Grove 2 years ago, you might recall me saying not all regulators around the world are as cool as our Federal Communication Commission. I mean that in this respect. The FCC provides us, despite some of the limitations that Kurt just talked about in his talk with respect to HF symbol rate, when it comes to building equipment and being able to play and transport the equipment that we build, the FCC has some very liberal regulations that allow us to play, and that's a good thing. That may not be the case in a number of places around the world. I recently attended a meeting in the Dominican Republic as part of my application for a reciprocal amateur radio license there. I had to describe the equipment that was in my station, provide a serial number that was on the back of my transceiver. That was easy enough to do for my FT817ND. But had my little QRP rig that I built using dead bug construction on a copper ground plane been brought there, I wonder if they would have raised an eyebrow down at Indotel. It's something to think about. So whatever comes out here, our goal was to not produce it, or our goal on this item is not to produce anything which could unduly hinder innovation within the amateur radio service. There are usually at least 3, sometimes 4, and in this last case going on 5 years between World Radio Communication Conferences. During that time, a great deal of work is done on the agenda in order to give the conference a good idea of what the problem is and how they might go about resolving it. The first thing that they recognized is, well, gee, we're considering software-defined radio and cognitive radio systems, and we don't have a definition about what they are. So let's come up with a definition. So after a couple of years of work in ITUR Study Group 1, they came up with definitions for software-defined radio and cognitive radio systems. I actually first presented these when they were essentially hot off the press 2 years ago, and they haven't changed. They've been adopted, and they're generally non-controversial. A software-defined radio is defined as a radio transmitter and/or receiver employing a technology that allows the RF operating parameters, including but not limited to frequency range, modulation type, or output power, to be set or altered by software excluding changes to operating parameters which occur during the normal pre-installed and predetermined operation of a radio according to a system specification or standard. This last clause kind of makes me wonder, well, gee, if you define your software in accordance with the system specification, is anything really software-defined radio? But whatever, that's what they came up with. Cognitive radio systems are a little bit harder to get your head around. Essentially, what people envision with cognitive radio is a scenario where a transmitter will sense its environment, find an empty channel, and hop on that channel and transmit to one receiver or a number of receivers. It's essentially spectrum management by machine. That's brings up a number of issues. It doesn't work very well with the passive services, such as radio astronomy. It doesn't work very well if you have a differently configured cognitive radio than you do of a nearby passive receiver. Say, for instance, if a cognitive radio wanted to use what it considered a TV white space, and I had a cognitive radio here and right next to it, an over-the-air television receiver, which was pointed with a Yagi back to Washington, so I could pick up ABC7 or something like that. Well, you know, in the middle of this room, this cognitive radio receiver might not, with a little rubber duck antenna, might not realize there's a channel 7 around here and pick that frequency. So those are some of the issues that come up with. And they try to define what the goals of cognitive radio are here. A cognitive radio system is a radio system employing technology that allows the system to obtain knowledge of its operational and geographical environment. One has to question as to whether silicon can really have knowledge, but that's neither here nor there. Obtain knowledge of its operational and geographical environment, establish policies and its internal state to dynamically and autonomously adjust its operational parameters and protocols according to its obtained knowledge in order to achieve predefined objectives and to learn from the results obtained. Once again, it's essentially spectrum management by machine. So we've got these definitions. Now, the question that remained unanswered when I last spoke with you 2 years ago is what would the ITU do now that these definitions have been adopted? Well, in my view, the results of the conference preparatory meeting are largely satisfactory in that the answer is not much. Not much is a good answer. It will avoid introduction of provisions into the ITU radio regulations which could, if viewed strictly, inhibit our ability to experiment. On STR, the situation is actually quite good. Let me talk a little bit, step back a little bit. This will go off the slides. The CPM report for each agenda item discusses the background and the objectives of the agenda item, discusses a number of issues that may be of concern, proposes a number of methods for the satisfaction of the agenda item, and lists a number of advantages and disadvantages for each agenda item. For software-defined radio, there really was not a whole lot of discussion. Everybody, once a few countries got past the idea of can you really use software to that extensively in a radio? Of course, we know the answer there, but you've got to keep in mind that these are international regulators and there are a lot of lawyers there, so hell, what do we know? But eventually, they pretty quickly came to the conclusion that any radio station that's been reconfigured to continue to meet the regulatory requirements of whatever service it's operating in it doesn't matter whether that reconfiguration is made by hardware or software. So it became clear that the existing radio regulations could encompass the implementation of SDR with no modification whatsoever. And there is one and only one method that is proposed in the CPM report for software-defined radio, and that is no change to the radio regulations. No change is good. We can operate now. We can operate in the future. At least we can operate now to the extent that our administration permits and that other countries will permit. So under this method, technical and operational considerations related to SDR technologies implemented at stations of a radio communication service will be addressed in ITUR text as appropriate. ITUR texts are recommendations and reports which essentially document how various technologies are being used in the amateur radio service. Software-defined radio use in the amateur service has been extensively documented thanks to the work of my predecessor, Paul Rinaldo, and others. That's among the documentation which we're looking to update in an ongoing update of the amateur amateur service documents over the next year or so. The advantages: it allows administrations to facilitate implementation of SDR. That's a good thing. We can take our radios, we can go overseas if administrations take this to heart and let it go forward. Disadvantages identified were none. This is as close to a slam dunk win as one gets in this business, and I'm really happy with how this came out. Now let's look at Cognative for a minute. Cognative radio systems generated a little more discussion. Let's step back and talk a little bit about the procedure by which the CPM report is assembled. This is a little bit lawyerly, right up my alley. The rules of the conference preparatory meeting are such that one administration, if they insist, can propose a method for the CPM report. As a general rule, ITU decisions are taken by consensus. This is an exception. If one country wants to move something forward, they can insist that it be moved forward. There is at least one country, maybe two, who have been advocating for a fairly significant regulatory regime with respect to cognitive radio systems, to the extent of establishing perhaps a pilot channel by which cognitive systems could communicate with each other. That channel being service independent, which really doesn't fit in well with the concept of radio services as currently defined by the ITU. And those particular administrations, the one that's at the forefront of this is actually Finland, encouraged by a large cellular telephone manufacturer in Finland, has been pushing to have a fairly significant regulatory scheme. That's not a satisfactory approach in my view. It's not the approach the United States favors or the Western Hemisphere, the Americas as a region favor. The CETEL position is actually in accordance with the United States position. But nevertheless, even though they were talked away from establishing an extensive regulatory scheme to be considered at this time, Finland still wants to push the issue and discuss it in the future. So we have two methods here. Method A is the one favored by the United States, no change to the radio regulations. Same argument and rationale as exists for software-defined radio. It essentially says, look, cognitive radio is going to operate within one service. We're going to use the rules of that service and we'll move forward. So it allows administrations to facilitate implementation but it doesn't provide guidance for the studies and provisions for the implementation. This is the United States argument. This language was submitted by Finland. So option B is the option that is favored to essentially kick the issue down the road and continue advocacy for a more stringent regulatory scheme. But it won't impose any new methods right now. Another ITUR resolution will be developed to provide a framework to facilitate studies and technical and operational considerations, blah, blah, blah. This essentially kicks the issue down the road, which also is not terribly bad because it takes 10 to 15 years for the ITU to do anything. Advantages: administrations can still implement CRS, and the resolution will provide a framework for guidance on further studies, but it doesn't provide provisions for the implementation of CRS. This one, once again, authored by everybody, and these two proposed by one administration. So that's where the landscape for cognitive radio stands. I'm not sure how it's going to end up, but there is strong regional support among multiple regions for option A, which is as good as you can get before you go into a World Radio Conference. Now, we've got a caveat here, and here's where the technical content comes in. The value of the CPM report as we stand right here is some value x, such that x is greater than 0. The moment the WRC starts, the value of the CPM report is going to be x such that x is 0. So you might be wondering, gee, Brennan, why do we send ARRL all this membership money so that you can go over to the conference preparatory meeting to generate a report that has a value of 0 at the beginning of the conference? Well, it's not, there are a couple of reasons why. First of all, it is an influential document to guide the starting point, guide the work of the conference as it starts. But why does it equal 0 on January 23rd, 2012? Well, it equals 0 then because a number of administrations really are not engaged in the conference preparatory process until the conference begins. And any administration can come up with an idea that may have been discussed before and may have been determined to be not a way they want to pursue, but they can bring it back up. That's why the conference lasts 4 weeks. The first 2.5 weeks are essentially spent rehashing things that have already been hashed out. So that's the caveat. Anything can happen at a World Radio Conference. The outcome is inherently uncertain. I think we've done a very good job on this particular agenda item to ensure a favorable outcome to amateur radio and a variety of other radio services. The United States commercial interests are quite happy with the approach the United States is taking as well, and I'm glad to be able to join them. There are more issues than you might think where commercial wireless operators and amateur radio interests are aligned. Things like this on issues where the ability to freely innovate might be threatened are issues where we find a great deal of common ground. I'm moving through relatively quickly here. I'll try to leave some time for questions. With respect to what else is going on WRC-12, defensively, HF and VHF radar are really the issues that are of most concern to us. It looks like on the VHF front, the proponents have settled on a space object detection system that they want to put at 154 to 156 megahertz. It's well away from, well, not well away, but away enough from the amateur band, from the 2-meter amateur band where we ought not to have an issue. HF oceanographic radar is something that's a little bit fluid. You may have read on the ARRL website that the United States is proposing to allow HF oceanographic radars to operate on 5250 to 5450 kilohertz. as a member of the United States delegation, I am constrained to say that that is a good idea. People who are appropriate are working that issue. And there's a wide divergence of opinion between, I will say that the United States stands alone on that particular frequency range, and that issue is probably more in flux than any other agenda item before the conference, including the one that we're working on to gain an allocation. The agenda for the conference has an item, 1.23, which considers a secondary allocation somewhere in the range 415 to 526.5 kilohertz. I urge you not to call this 500 kilohertz. 500 kilohertz waves a big red flag to a number of maritime interests, real and imagined. The United States, after a significant negotiation and after significant opposition by maritime interests, has taken an affirmative position on this agenda item. It has become the position of the Americas through our regional preparation and the hard work of my colleague John Seiberling. I'm glad to say that the African Telecommunication Union is also proposing an affirmative method that's a little bit different than the United States method. But to have two regions going in supporting your agenda item is a good outcome, and efforts in the other regions continue. Finally, WRC-12 will determine the agenda for what is being called WRC-15. I don't believe for a second it's going to be held in 2015, but the preliminary agenda says WRC-15, so until it says anything else, it's WRC-15. It is a near certainty that a reallocation, that a potential reallocation will be considered for mobile broadband and IMT applications on the WRC-15 agenda. The push within the United States among our regulators and among the current administration to reallocate spectrum, it will have a parallel on the international level. There are simply too many countries who are interested in doing something like this, I think, for this item to be avoided. And we're developing strategies along with the rest of the wireless industry in order to try to make sure that our oxen aren't gored. So that IMT is an acronym for International Mobile Telecommunications. It's ITU speak for these things. High bandwidth cell phones. So with that, I still have about 12 minutes left, but I'm done. And I'd be pleased to ask questions. I think Bruce had his hand up first.
Well, in tying in with the last talk, how do international regulations, rather than what we do to ourselves, restrict us from operating spread spectrum on HF, especially for emergency communications?
The restrictions on spread spectrum in this country are strictly self-imposed. By self-imposed, I mean FCC imposed. There is no provision in either the table of allocations or Article 25 of the radio regulations, which deals with the amateur service that would restrict that. So there are very few restrictions in the international radio regulations. It did take a long time for them to for the radio regulations to remove a CW proficiency requirement, but aside from very minimal guidelines, I could put the entire article on one slide, and kind of wish I had done so that I could point out the very few regulations that there are. So, yes, sir.
If Finland has a position, obviously Nokia has a position. What is Nokia's position as far as regulations are concerned for software-defined and cognitive radios?
I've been following. This work has been done in a variety of ITU study groups. I personally attend Study Group 5, which deals with all the terrestrial services, including land mobile and IMT. I have sat in on some discussions of cognitive radio in the land mobile service. Those discussions are actually being chaired by Hitoshi Yoshino, who is from Japan, but also is a ham, and in fact holds the United States Amateur Radio license, although I cannot remember his call for the life of me right now. The position, frankly, seems to be somewhat in flux. What I can tell you is that they would like a more defined regime for cognitive radio operations, essentially establishing, ideally in their mind, an inter-service pilot channel through which cognitive systems could communicate with one another, and also a less service-defined segmentation. I think that if they could envision a future where there are no individual radio services, but everything tends to converge into one service, and that their equipment could transcend various types of operation, I think that's my sense of what they would like to do. The position seems to shift in fine grades each meeting, and it really hasn't gained a lot of support, but it continues to be advanced. And that may not be a very satisfactory answer, but it's, if you think it's difficult to hear me say and understand it with me saying it, I invite you to sit in a meeting with the proponents one time.
So why would a regulation go into how you implement the radio? Why at all debate the software-defined radio?
Because enough countries at the last WRC wanted to. I know that that's somewhat of a flippant answer, but why did the issue even come up? Because someone brought it up and brought it up with enough persuasion to put it on the agenda. I think it's been beneficial to the technology to be on a microscope under the international stage, and I think the prevailing view is along the lines indicated by the question that you asked. Why specify?
It's an implementation.
Yes, and that's been that was our argument from the beginning, and it's been persuasive. It's carried the day.
Cognitive, I can understand.
Cognitive presents some issues that are scary, not the least of which is it could put me out of work.
Changes that are requested, are those primarily driven by political interests or commercial interests?
The changes that are, the agenda for each WRC is determined by the previous conference. It's essentially, the result is it's a result of negotiations among governments. The issues that are important to one administration will be traded off against issues that are important to other administrations. The amateur agenda item got added to, as my understanding, I wasn't in the employ of the league at the time, but it's my understanding it got added late in the agenda when the sentiment was, let's try to do something for the amateurs next time because we just shut them down on 5 megs. So, and it was easy enough, from what I understand, to push through because the maritime interests had just abandoned that particular frequency range as an emergency calling frequency range. In short order, they regretted doing that.
It is really scary what was almost in the rules. Things like notch filters in D to A's so that it would not it be used to interfere with certain kinds of communications. It was truly scary. And so when myself and others were invited to give in-camera testimony, that means in private, we really lowered the boom on these stupid regulations. We really did. And eventually, the rules that came out were reasonable. They're not perfect, but they were reasonable, as Brendan is saying. But I'm telling you, what we almost had was horrible. So, and the problem with cognitive radio right now to all of these different countries and so forth is they don't really know what it is. Yeah. There's not a real instantiation of a cognitive radio to provide a real service to people so that they can say, I know what it is now and I want to regulate it in this way, because there is no it yet to regulate.
Right. And that's one of the reasons why the value of the CPM report on January 23rd is going to be zero, because we're going to have a number of administrations that have not previously been engaged who all of a sudden are going to say, hey, wait a minute, what is this? And we're going to have some of the same discussions over and over again. You know, I thank you for your efforts
What we really need is an 802.11 kind of thing that says, go have fun.
Yeah, and that, I'd like to pay tribute to my predecessor, and I'd even do so even if he weren't in the room back there. But Ronaldo's rule of amateur radio progress is, correct me if I'm misquoting this, Paul. Progress in amateur radio is made by allowing energetic individuals to move forward. And the less rules you have on the book, the more easy it is for you to move forward. That's what we want to do. Once again, ARRL is pleased to co-sponsor this conference. Please continue doing what you're doing. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your membership. We could not do what we do without you.